What no one saw coming was that the quietest man in Hollywood would walk onto Steve Harvey's stage and crack open a conversation so raw, so spiritual, that the entire studio fell silent and hearts were changed forever. The studio lights shimmered above, catching the nervous flutter of cue cards and the shuffling of audience members into their seats. Steve Harvey stood just off stage, adjusting his tailored suit and tapping his cue card with a rhythmic flick. Another show, another guest. But today felt different. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the silence in the air before the cameras rolled. Maybe it was just age catching up with intuition. The audience roared when the stage announcer bellowed, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Keanu Reeves." Keanu walked out with his usual quiet grace, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jeans, a dark blazer hanging comfortably on his shoulders, and that mysterious half-smile, the one that felt like it came from somewhere far away. The crowd erupted. He gave a modest wave, bowed his head slightly, and made his way to the plush chair beside Steve. "Man, you really are like a unicorn," Steve joked as the applause died down. "Ain't nobody ever seen a man this famous ride the subway and still be this calm." The crowd laughed. Keanu chuckled softly. "I don't think peace comes from what you have. I think it comes from what you can let go." Steve raised his eyebrows. Okay, you already starting deep," he said with a grin, but there was something behind that smile, a flicker of curiosity, even caution. They talked about movies, motorcycles, and that one time Keanu gave away most of his salary from The Matrix to the special effects team. The audience was mesmerized, not just by the stories, but by how Keanu told them, with a gentle honesty that made every word feel like it carried weight. Steve leaned forward, his voice dropping just a touch. "You know, man, you've been through a lot. Lost your girl, lost your baby, lost your best friend. You ever just ask, why me?" Keanu looked down at his hands for a moment. The studio went quiet, a kind of reverent stillness you only feel when the soul starts speaking. "I used to," he said quietly. "But one night, I couldn't sleep. I was in a hotel in Tokyo. I felt hollow. I thought about ending it." Steve's face changed. "Serious now? What stopped you?" Keanu looked at him, really looked at him. "You did." Steve blinked. "What? Me?" "You probably don't remember," Keanu said. "It was a clip. Someone had stitched together a bunch of your interviews, one where you talked about how pain ain't permanent, that God don't waste a wound. You said, your darkest moment might just be the key to someone else's light. I watched that on loop. That line? It kept me alive." Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and like the video so you don't miss tomorrow's video. Steve's jaw dropped slightly. For a moment, he couldn't speak. And when he finally did, his voice was different, shaken. "Man, I was just talking. I didn't know anyone was really listening." Keanu smiled, and this time it wasn't the usual quiet smile. It was something more tender, almost vulnerable. Sometimes, it's the words we don't even think matter that save someone. Steve swallowed hard, trying to keep the tears from falling in front of the cameras. "You just flipped the whole show, man." The audience was still stunned. A ripple of emotion moved through the room like a slow wave. People weren't just listening anymore. They were feeling. You can see it in their faces. Wide eyes, hands over mouths, a few people already wiping away tears. Steve leaned back in his chair, trying to find his footing. I don't even know what to say," he finally muttered, looking down at his cue cards like they had betrayed him. "I was supposed to ask you about your next movie." Keanu chuckled softly. "We can talk about that, if you want. But maybe this is the real interview." Steve looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right." He set the cards down on the coffee table between them. "Let's talk, man to man." Keanu's voice was calm, like someone telling a story by the fire. There's a kind of silence you reach when everything breaks. When you're standing at the bottom of what you thought was your life, and there's no one left to call. No noise, no promises, just you and your own breath. He paused, eyes fixed on some invisible point just past the cameras. "When I lost Jennifer and the baby, I used to sit in the dark. I remember thinking that grief isn't something you heal from. It's something you carry, like a scar that never fully closes." Steve nodded slowly. Yeah, I know that one." Keanu looked at him. "You ever lose someone and think, I should have been better. Maybe if I had done this or said that, they'd still be here." Steve didn't speak at first. When he did, his voice was low and cracked. "My mama. I was out here chasing dreams, trying to prove something to everybody. She died while I was on the road doing stand-up. I missed her last breath, and I've never stopped hearing that silence since. They sat there, two men from different worlds, bonded by grief. "You said something once," Keanu said, his voice softer now. "Sometimes, God lets you hit rock bottom to show you he's the rock at the bottom. I didn't understand that until everything I loved was gone. And somehow, I was still breathing, still waking up. And one day, I realized maybe I wasn't supposed to heal. Maybe I was supposed to use the pain." Steve nodded, eyes glassy. "Ain't that something? You never know who's watching, who's listening. I was just talking to the camera, and you were on the other side of the world hearing your own heart in it." The audience sat in absolute stillness. No cheers, no claps, just the heavy hum of human connection. And Keanu, who rarely shared much at all, finally exhaled and said, "We carry pain not because we deserve it, but because someone else will need to see us survive it." Steve whispered, "Say that again." Keanu looked him straight in the eye. "We carry pain not because we deserve it, but because someone else will need to see us survive it." The studio felt like church now, quiet, sacred, reverent. Even the cameras moved more gently, as if not to interrupt the weight of what was unfolding. No one was expecting a sermon on pain and purpose today, least of all Steve Harvey. But now here he was, speechless, sitting across from a man who had become a vessel for something much bigger than an interview. Steve rubbed his chin slowly, still processing. "You know, man, all these years, I've been cracking jokes, telling stories, trying to keep folks inspired. Never thought I'd be part of someone's lifeline like that." Keanu nodded slowly. "We never really know who we're talking to. Not fully." There was a long pause, then Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever wonder if maybe all this pain we go through, it's not just for us?" Keanu's gaze dropped for a moment. "All the time." The camera zoomed in subtly, catching the soft tremble in his voice. "When I lost my daughter, I didn't want to live. And after Jennifer passed, I disappeared into work, into quiet places. I didn't think anyone would understand. I didn't want to be a burden." He glanced toward the audience, his voice gaining a quiet power. "But then someone told me grief is the price you pay for love." That hit me hard, because it meant the pain wasn't punishment. It was proof. Proof that what we had mattered. Steve covered his mouth briefly, holding back a wave of emotion. "Some nights," Keanu continued, "I'd lie there and wonder if my life had any purpose left. If maybe I was just meant to survive quietly. And then, that night in Tokyo, I found your clip. You were just being you, funny, raw, real. You said, 'Don't give up. Don't you dare let your story end in the middle of a sentence.'" Steve blinked, stunned. "I said that." "You did," Keanu said, smiling. "And it felt like God was speaking through you." The audience gasped softly. One woman wiped tears from her eyes. Another held her hand to her chest. Steve leaned back in his chair, eyes glistening. "Man, I didn't even remember saying that. That was just me, doing what I do." Keanu nodded. "Exactly. That's the point. Sometimes your purpose speaks loudest when you're not even trying. The ones who are watching, the ones who are listening, they're often invisible to you. But they're there." Steve looked out into the audience, then up at the rafters. "How many people we pass every day, huh? Fighting battles we don't see? And maybe just one word, one smile, one honest moment could be what pulls them through." Keanu's voice was barely above a whisper now. "You saved me, Steve. You didn't know it, but you did." And Steve, with tears finally rolling down his cheeks, whispered back, "And you just saved me." For a few precious seconds, time stood still. No lights flashed. No music played. No applause cue lit up the screens. Just the raw sound of two men sitting in their truth, one once lost, now grateful, the other just realizing that his words, tossed into the world like pebbles into a pond, had reached shores he never imagined. Steve leaned back, trying to compose himself, but it was no use. He took out a handkerchief from his inside pocket, dabbed his eyes, and looked up at the ceiling as if hoping God might explain how something so simple, an old video clip, a heartfelt message, could be a literal lifeline. Keanu didn't speak. He just sat quietly, letting Steve feel it. That's the thing about Keanu. He doesn't try to fix a moment. He just honors it. Then Steve turned to the audience. "You know what y'all just witnessed," he said, voice hoarse. "Purpose. Divine purpose. You don't need a platform like this to have it. You don't need money, fame, or followers. All you need is to live from the truth in you." The crowd nodded silently, many dabbing at their eyes. Someone whispered, "Amen." Steve looked back at Keanu. "You could have come here and talked about your career, your stunts, all the cool stuff. But instead, you came here and reminded us we're all broken somewhere." Keanu smiled gently. "And we're all trying to heal quietly, hoping maybe someone notices. hoping it matters. He paused, then added, "What if the pain you carry is exactly what someone else needs to see you carry? Not because you're perfect, but because you didn't quit." The camera panned across the room, audience members gripped by the weight of what was being said. A young man in the third row bowed his head, hands clenched. A middle-aged woman closed her eyes and whispered something only she could hear. And for a fleeting moment, there was no celebrity, no host, no crowd, just a room full of souls remembering their worth. Steve leaned forward again, the tears finally giving way to a smile. "I ain't never gonna forget this day." "Me neither," Keanu said. "You gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost." "What's that?" Steve asked softly. Keanu looked at him, eyes filled with something both peaceful and powerful. "Hope." The conversation slowed, the studio still humming with a quiet, sacred energy. It felt like the world outside had stopped spinning for a moment. The usual fast pace of television, lights flashing, cameras moving, the rapid-fire transitions had vanished. In its place was a deep, unspoken understanding. It was as if everyone, both on stage and in the audience, had realized something profound. Keanu shifted slightly in his chair, his gaze never leaving Steve. There was something about the stillness, something that made him feel anchored to this moment. The kind of moment that doesn't happen often, when you connect with someone not because of fame or fortune, but because you both understand the weight of life's deepest challenges. Steve wiped his eyes again, his voice calm but powerful. "You know, when I got started, I wanted nothing more than to make people laugh. I thought laughter was the answer. And I still think it is, to an extent. But this right here? This might be the real reason I'm here. I don't just want to make you laugh anymore. I want to make sure you feel something too, that you know someone sees you, someone hears you." Keanu nodded, his hands resting in his lap, fingers intertwined. "It's the quiet moments that save us. It's the things we say to each other when we're vulnerable, those moments when we stop pretending, when we just let ourselves be." Steve glanced out toward the audience, his gaze sweeping across faces that had been moved. Some of them still had tears in their eyes, others were just sitting quietly, taking it all in. "You know," Steve said, his voice strong again, "we all carry this weight. This sense that we gotta fix everything, control how people see us. But maybe the real purpose, our real job, is just to show up, to be present, even in the mess." Keanu smiled softly. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? Just showing up. Not pretending to have it all together, but still standing there anyway." The words hung in the air, and for a brief second, it felt like Steve had just spoken not just for himself, but for everyone. The hidden pain, the untold stories, the courage it takes to keep moving forward every day. Steve leaned forward, fixing his gaze on Keanu. "You know, we might not have all the answers, but in this moment, right here, we're both telling the truth. And that's all we really need." Keanu nodded. "Sometimes the truth is the most powerful thing we can give." Steve's eyes were glistening again, but his smile was wide and genuine. "And that, my friend, is the thing we all need. Not the perfect answer, not the picture-perfect life, just the truth. The real, messy, painful, beautiful truth." Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, the truth. It's like a light, isn't it? You shine it, and you realize it's never just about you. It's always bigger than us. And that's where the hope comes from." And just like that, the energy shifted. The crowd, who had been silent for so long, began to stir. A few soft claps started, then grew louder, until the entire studio was on their feet, clapping, cheering. Not for the actors, not for the host, but for the message they'd just shared, for the truth they'd spoken, for the rawness that had finally connected them all in a way that nothing else could. Keanu and Steve stood, joining the applause. Keanu, typically reserved, let himself soak in the moment, his face reflecting both humility and gratitude. Steve, ever the showman, raised his hands in the air, waving to the crowd, but this time, his words were real. "Thank you, man. Thank you for showing me the way." Keanu nodded, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "No, thank you. For reminding me we're all in this together." The applause eventually faded, but the feeling it left behind lingered, thick and sweet, like incense in a sacred space. The audience slowly settled back into their seats, but something about them had changed. You could see it in their eyes. Something deep had been stirred. Hearts had cracked open. Steve and Keanu sat again, but the energy between them was no longer just between two men. It was as if the entire room had become one breath, exhaling together after holding something heavy for far too long. Steve leaned back, resting his hand over his chest. "You know what I'm realizing?" Right now, in real time? He asked. Keanu tilted his head gently. What's that? Steve took a deep breath, eyes glistening again, but steady now. That moment you told me my words helped you, that they reached you when you were thinking of giving up. He paused, the emotion trembling in his voice. I've had so many nights where I doubted myself, where I thought none of this really mattered, that all the words, all the shows, all the effort, it was just noise in the wind. Keanu nodded slowly. But it wasn't. Steve looked at him, the weight of that truth settling in. No, it wasn't. And I think there's a lesson in that. We don't know who's watching us, who's holding on because of something we said, or something we lived through. The room was quiet again, not with tension, but reverence. Keanu's voice came soft but firm. When you spoke that night, Steve, you didn't know it would find someone like me. And when I listened, I didn't know I'd ever get to thank you. But that's the thing about faith and purpose. They echo beyond what we see. He looked out into the audience, then toward the camera, straight to the viewers watching at home. And I want to say this for anyone out there who feels invisible, who thinks their life doesn't matter. It does. You're not forgotten. The pain you're walking through might be the very light someone else needs to follow. Steve wiped his eyes one last time, shaking his head with a smile that held both joy and disbelief. God works in the quiet, don't he? Keanu smiled. Always has. The two men sat in peaceful silence for a few seconds, like old friends who didn't need to fill the air anymore. There was nothing left to prove, just the truth between them. A bond built not through fame or success, but through brokenness and the quiet strength that rises from it. And somewhere in the control room, a director was crying too, whispering, "We're not cutting this. Let it run." The cameras were still rolling, but no one cared about airtime anymore. Ratings, ad breaks, tight schedules, none of it mattered in the presence of something so deeply human. Something divine. What was unfolding on that stage wasn't entertainment. It was healing. Steve leaned back in his chair, his energy softer now, humbled. You know, he said, voice low and reflective, a lot of people think the curtain drops at the end of the show, and that's it. Lights out. Go home. But sometimes, the real light shows up after the curtain falls. Keanu nodded slowly. Because that's when the act ends, and the real begins. They shared a look, one of those quiet exchanges between men who've been through the fire and come out not untouched, but transformed. Steve turned toward the audience again. How many of y'all have been through something so painful you didn't think you'd make it? A few hands rose hesitantly. Then more. Then nearly the whole room. He nodded. Look around. Look at that. That's life right there. That's faith. That's purpose. Keanu leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. And maybe, just maybe, that pain didn't break you. Maybe it carved you, shaped you into someone stronger, someone softer, someone who understands. The lights dimmed slightly as the crew, sensing the emotional depth, leaned into it with grace. The camera caught the tears on cheeks, the hand squeezes between friends, the woman in the back row holding her chest like she'd just remembered she was alive. Steve let out a deep sigh, the kind that releases more than air, it lets go of old burdens. You saved me today, Keanu. Not because you planned it, but because you showed up with the truth. And I realize now, every joke I told, every story I shared over the years, I wasn't just trying to survive, I was reaching. Trying to help someone I didn't even know was listening. Keanu smiled, but it wasn't just a smile. It was a knowing, a soul's nod. And you did. You helped me. And now maybe I can help someone else. The studio faded into a moment of stillness again, the kind that feels like prayer. Then Steve spoke one last time for that segment. So here's what I want to say to anyone watching this. If you're in the dark right now, don't you dare believe you're alone in it. The pain you feel, it's not your end. It might just be your beginning. Keanu added gently, the light always finds its way back, even through the cracks. And with that, two men bowed their heads, not in defeat, but in reverence, because they both knew now, without a doubt, that when the curtain falls, the light remains.